Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. We are almost done with January 2025. A 12th of the year is already gone. It's unbelievable how fast time flies sometimes. I am recording in a slightly different place, so if the audio sounds a little different than the normal weekend perspective, I apologize for that. We try and keep things as consistent as possible, but once in a while we move around a little bit. Microphones are a little bit different, but again, hope everybody's doing well. I am up here in the mountains getting a little bit of time with some snow. It has been very, very cold here in the south. It's unusually cold, so we're all dealing with a little bit of unusual weather here, a little bit of unusual weather in a lot of different places, and again, our hearts go out to all the things happening out in Southern California with the wildfires. If you get a chance to make a contribution to help out a little bit, that's always appreciated. I know they would appreciate it. We appreciate everybody who helped us in North Carolina when things were tough last fall, and we try and do the same thing for our brothers and sisters out in California as well. So, anyways, with that, I want to get to this week's weekend perspective. And for those of you who listen to a lot of podcasts, I had a chance to be on the Software Defined Interviews podcast this week with Whitney and Cote. And Cote asked me, he said, you've been doing this thing for a while with the weekend perspectives, or Sunday sermons, as he likes to call them. And he said, how do you come up with an answer, or how do you come up with a topic for these things? Because he's also somebody who creates a whole bunch of content and covers a lot of topics. And I don't know that I gave him the greatest answer in the world, but if you want to listen to some of the thought process behind that, I'll put a link in the show notes. You can take a listen. It's fun podcast I do over on Software Defined Interviews, different than Software Defined Talk. Tim and Whitney, they get to talk to a lot of interesting people in the community. I don't know that I fit in the interesting category, but I appreciate them having me on. And but I'll put a link to the show. Might be one of the ones you want to add to your rotation. Anyways, so what I want to get to today is, it feels like we've got a lot. January is typically a very quiet month, although from year to year that can change a little bit. And this year, obviously, things are changing a little bit because we have a new political administration here in the United States, as well as we had the inauguration, and new president came into play. And whenever you have a new political party comes into play, one of the first things they try and do is they will typically have what they call a 100-day plan, which is their opportunity in the first 100 days, when there's a lot of enthusiasm for what they were elected to do. People are still excited about the potential change in political parties. They often try and lay out a 100-day plan, and what that really is trying to symbolize is we're listening. We're going to try and get a lot done. We're not just we're just not just sort of sitting on our laurels. And so there was a lot of folks who felt a little bit overwhelmed by the amount of announcements that came out of the U.S. election, the U.S. inauguration that came out here for the 20th of January. I didn't really necessarily want to talk about that so much, but I want to talk about sort of two announcements that came out this last week. And how do we think about them? As, are they big announcements, or are they big announcements, or are they just, sort of noise that are sort of masquerading as a big announcement? And so the two that I grabbed, and again, we're always trying to find the right balance between stuff that's cloud related and AI related. But right now, we're hitting a lot of stuff that's AI related. So, but I think the thought process in this one will be relevant whether you're thinking about new things you're hearing in the cloud space or the security space or whatever it might be. So the two announcements we had one which was announced on Inauguration Day, and it was something called Project Stargate, which is a initiative to start to build data centers, or a sort of campus of data centers in the United States. I believe in Texas, although that may expand into other locations and so forth. And the sort of the headline of this was, there's going to be $500 billion put into this project to be really kind of a huge leap forward way of addressing kind of all the challenges that are going on with AI, from, data center operations to power and cooling to, the next generation of models and all these sort of things. And it was sort of a high profile announcement because you had a number of very large companies that were, as part of the announcement. So it was OpenAI, it was Oracle, it was Microsoft, it was NVIDIA. It was a couple of very large, funding sources, both from the Middle East as well as Japan and so forth. And it was also announced as part of the inauguration day. So the president got involved with it and so forth. And so you had that sort of announcement, right? Big headlines, big numbers announced, big sort of long-term, what's this going to do to reshape, the United States is an AI player in the game versus, other things in the market. So big sort of headliney sort of announcement. And then a couple of days ago, there was a sort of a low-key announcement that sort of came out. And it was one of those ones that you're not exactly sure why it came out, when it came out, but it came out. And it was something called DeepSeek. DeepSeek's a Chinese company who has been going after, trying to build sort of frontier models. And they came out with something that was their DeepSeek model, DeepSeek R1. And it was the interesting thing about it was, it was sort of a low key announcement. It wasn't a lot of sort of pomp and circumstance. It wasn't a lot of numbers thrown around. But in essence, this was a Chinese company who had sort of, I want to say, took like the kind of original Google route, which was, we're going to try and build sort of frontier level technology, but we're going to build it on less than sort of cutting edge hardware. And so they had cobbled together that, the number was like 10,000 sort of previous generation, less than cutting edge GPUs. And in the interest in this one was, here you had somebody who, and oh, by the way, the number that was thrown around was it cost them, $5 or $6 million to train this model that is now, in certain categories of like math and reasoning, now on par with sort of the cutting edge OpenAI model, right? And what was interesting about this one was not so much the where it was in terms of performance. That was obviously very interesting to people. But what was very interesting was this was a very, very low cost amount of dollars to do this training, and it was done not using the latest and greatest hardware. And so it was one of those announcements that sort of makes people step back and go, oh, okay, what does this mean, right? Like, and I say this in the context of, we have been sort of living in this world now from an AI perspective that everything was about the latest and greatest hardware, the latest and greatest frontier models, the most amount of money that somebody could spend. And these guys sort of came along and did what Google had done, 30 years ago when it was just Larry and Sergey, basically cobbling together a bunch of leftover computers from the Stanford lab and wherever they could find them in Palo Alto, and built this search engine that was, far and away better and easier to use, cheaper than, all these other ones that existed in the market, again, 20, 25, 30 years ago, before Google became the search powerhouse that they are. And so these two things sort of got me thinking, we live in a time in which right now it feels like, especially in the AI space, but we've lived through this with cloud and a lot of other things, there are a ton of announcements happening right now. And you sort of have to ask yourself, like, how do I sort through all of this? How do I make sense of all of this? And it's nice to have certain people that, whether they're on podcasts or they're in written form, do some analysis for you. And that's always very helpful. But there's a certain amount of, kind of internalizing you have to do with these announcements. And so I was thinking about, like, how do I go about doing this? So it was one of the questions that Cote had asked me in the other podcast was, or actually Whitney had asked, like, how do we go about internalizing and rationalizing and analyzing all this information that comes out? And I thought maybe this compare and contrast between these two types of announcements, one maybe being big and another being big, in the capital B big way. And so, I kind of walked through this thing in my mind, right? Number one, why is the announcement happening now? Well, in the case of the first announcement, the announcement about the Stargate project that had, that involved the president and all these big companies, it was there to sort of capture the pomp and circumstance of this new, this new group that was going to be in power. And it was, threw around a lot of big numbers to sort of get people motivated that, that this was a group of people that was thinking well beyond the box. They were thinking well beyond the norm, the status quo. They were going to completely rethink, what was possible. And they threw around a lot of big numbers, right? $500 billion and so forth. And so that was that type of announcement. Now, as that announcement was sort of broken down, people started kind of coming out and going, well, maybe that much money doesn't exactly exist today. Maybe they're not really ready to invest that much money today. We're not really sure the timeline is actually going to be what that's going to be. And there was a lot of sort of, what if questions. But this was an announcement about kind of making a big splash, about putting something really big out there to sort of, puff out your chest and say, we're going to, the equivalent of like, we're going to put a man on the moon, or we're going to, do something incredible that's never been seen before. And that was fine. So that was why that announcement came out. The reason why the DeepSeek one came out when it came out, I don't know. We don't really know. It just sort of came out, and it may have just been like, well, they'd been working on it for a while, and they'd reached a point in which, they'd achieved kind of their goal for the time, which was, hey, we beat a milestone that OpenAI had set, and it was their ability to say, hey, we've kind of changed the game, but it wasn't done with a lot of pomp and circumstance, and I think it sort of aligns to the sort of the details behind it, which was, we didn't do this in the mode of spending the most money and using the most leading edge technologies. We did this in sort of open availability or open source way. Open source has different definitions, but sort of an open source way, a low cost way, not using the latest technologies. And we just sort of want to put this out there as a new sort of marker out there for people to be like, we may have just changed the economics game of what's going on here. And that can be a very different thing. That sort of resets, to a certain extent, the playing field if the technology is what it appears to be, by many orders of magnitude. And that doesn't usually happen all that often. And sometimes, being humble and keeping that quiet is a good way to do that. So, why that happened is what happened. Second thing I tend to do with these is go like, what are the facts of the announcement? And I know I've talked about some of those here, which is, how much money has been announced, how much money is actually in play, what are the timelines that are going on here, what's the actual technology that's happening here, what of this is new, what of this is just renaming or rebranding of something old or something existing. So in the case of Stargate, apparently this project has been going on since last summer, so it's not necessarily new. But again, it wanted to sort of ride the coattails of the inauguration and that so on and so forth. The facts of the DeepSeek one, we're still learning about, right? Some of it is out on places like Hugging Face and other places so that you can go and see it, and it's out in the open. And that's sort of shocking to people. Apparently, the rumor around Silicon Valley in a lot of places was, there were a lot of people in places like Meta and Google and OpenAI who were, up all night digging into like what's going on with this. How did they go about doing this? What data was used? What were the actual, so there's a lot of digging into the facts on the second one. The first one was less about facts and more about bluster. The second one was about, let's really dig into the facts here, because the things that you are claiming when you start making progress that looks to be orders of magnitude more than was there before, you want to start seeing, how much of this is true? Does the math work out? Is this smoke and mirrors? Where did you cut corners? What different choices did you make? Because the rest of the industry had been moving down a certain path and down a certain road with certain assumptions. Everybody was sort of playing by the same rules in the same game. And this is coming along and saying, no, I'm changing those. And so there's a lot of people really digging into those facts. And I think we'll learn more about those facts as the next kind of couple days and weeks and so forth kind of come forward. The next thing that I tend to do when I look at this is I start to look at, what are the technology impacts of this announcement? And then kind of in contrast, what are the economic impacts of this announcement, right? And I think when we look at both of these independently or at the same time, from a technology perspective, a couple of things you could take away from it. Number one is there is still a belief that there are huge frontiers for us to overcome, to determine, to uncover, in order to really kind of begin to turn this technology into something that's going to be really, really widespread, that potentially is going to be economically viable, and something that is going to require a lot more change in how we do things. So again, whether it's power and cooling or how data centers are operated or whatever that would be. So there's a lot going on there, and there is a reinforcement that like we're not in a later inning of this. We're still in very early days, and in fact, the sort of the future ahead of us is still very kind of gray. We're not exactly sure what's the next hurdle we're going to overcome, how long it will take to get to the next one. But the demand from people and the interest in this and the sort of science behind what's coming out continues to sort of advance very, very rapidly, right? So that's the technology of this. Now, the economics of this are really, really interesting, and maybe not so much the Stargate one, but the DeepSeek one. And this is where you start to have people question if the DeepSeek stuff is real, right? Meaning, sort of leading edge models can now be built for fractions, orders of magnitude less cost. And we don't necessarily always have to be using the latest and greatest GPU chips, which are very hard to get at. And we could be using, ones that have been around for a year, 2 years, 3 years. Maybe they can be networked in different ways. Maybe they can be, the technology can be prioritized in different ways. But that starts to bring in some really, really different economic questions and interesting economic questions. Like, for example, we saw just today, OpenAI kind of came back and said, hey, we're going to start changing some of the way that we charge for some of our premium tiers, our plus tier and our premium tier, our pro tier. And that's, a direct response to this model, which costs far, far less to build and train and so forth, being able to offer a service, right? So it brings into question, what will the future profitability of an OpenAI look like? What has the approach of OpenAI, who is perceived to be the very, very leading edge of this industry, have they been doing it all wrong, right? What does their economic future look like if somebody can come along and undercut what they're doing, or surpass what they're doing, but do it at 1/10 the price, 1/100th of the price, so on and so forth. The second order of magnitude is people like NVIDIA, right? NVIDIA has been living on the idea that you have to be always on the leading edge of the chips that they need. Their stock price is based on that supreme demand for this highly difficult commodity to come across, these GPUs to come across. Well, if people don't have to have the latest and greatest in order to be able to achieve sort of frontier level status, what does that do to the NVIDIA story? What does it do to the NVIDIA stock price and premium? What does it do to sort of all those sorts of things? But the flip side of that is, if potentially, right, some new way of doing this has been unlocked, right, and whether other people are able to figure out what DeepSeek did, or whether DeepSeek is able to become the next one in line to really build some sort of technology that overwhelms the world, sort of the DeepSeek version of ChatGPT or whatever that might be. What does that do? I mean, when the cost of a service drops by 100%, or is now 1/100th what it used to cost, or even 1/10th, what does that do for people trying to adopt this stuff, right? How fast does this accelerate that? How fast does it change people's minds from saying, oh gosh, I was hesitant about using that $200 a month pro offer, but if it's $2 a month, I'm absolutely going to start using that type of thing, right? It's not even a second thought, right? So it starts to have sort of downstream ramifications for what the enterprise and the consumer adoption models are going to look like, and the things that they've been thinking about. So all those things are going to be very, very interesting. The last thing I think about a lot is everything I've talked about so far in these big announcements has been kind of the, what do the vendors and the money people get out of this, right? What do the big AI shops, the big labs, and the VCs get out of this, or the sovereign wealth fund? But what doesn't feel like is being talked about very much is, sort of the enterprise adoption, the mid-sized market adoption, the consumer adoption of this. And this is where I think we're going to get into some really interesting conversations as we're seeing this pace of change happen, the velocity of change happen. And companies are going to have to start asking themselves some really interesting questions, right? Number one, what economic model made sense for me to consider AI, right? Was I looking at this from a augmentation perspective? Was I looking at it from a replacement perspective? And so what sort of economic model did I have in mind? What were we building around to where we were determining if AI was going to be valuable, or if these new ways of building applications were going to be valuable? Well, does that significantly change if the price of this stuff, significantly changes, right? So that's one of the things I think we're going to have to start seeing from companies is like, how flexible are their models? What are the price points? What are the thresholds that are impacting their ability to take on the technology, to adopt it in wider ways versus not adopt it? I think that's going to be a big thing to look at. The second thing I think is going to be really interesting to look at is, how are they going to operationalize this stuff? Because, just to put this in perspective, and I used to tell people this all the time, and this is an infrastructure-centric analogy, so bear with me. But, back in the day, let's just use sort of common, similar types of technologies. If you were using VMware for virtualization, VMware didn't come out with a new release, but every 18 months to 2 years, maybe even 2.5 or 3 years. So your infrastructure could stay very, very stable, right? You really were only having to touch it once every, let's say, 2 to 3 years. And you might have to do an upgrade, and you might have to, manage some high availability or some tiny outages or something like that. But you weren't having to think about it very often. Then you had something like OpenStack come along, and OpenStack was going to be the thing that disrupted VMware, right? Well, it had a like a once a year or 6 month, upgrade cycle. Like a new release came out every 6 to 12 months. And if you think about that, like, you've cut the time to change, which in the infrastructure space isn't necessarily considered a good thing, by somewhere between like half and 75%, right? So, going from every 2 or 3 years to every 12 months to 6 months is a humongous change to an organization. And thinking about, like, how are we going to do that? Is that beneficial to us? Is that something we want to work into what we do? And then you had Kubernetes come along, which again kind of, got positioned as sort of this infrastructure plus thing for application developers. And it was asking for upgrades every 3 months. Now it's on a 4-month cycle. But, you've gone from, very, very long cycles of stability to long cycles of having to manage how to do things very quickly. And again, that caused a lot of rethinking by enterprises of, like, how much value do we need in order to adopt this sort of thing? And I think we're going to see very similar things happen in the AI space. And I think companies are just starting to wrap their head around, like, what do I do in a world in which the people that are trying to dominate these markets, to shape these markets, are moving so fast that, in their mind, that's the only way to run this race, is to always stay in advance. But what does that mean for their downstream customers? I mean, what is it? What do you do when a model that you're planning to use comes and changes every three months? Are you sure the API you interface with is going to be the same API? Is it stable? Is it backwards compatible? Are your applications going to have to get completely retested? How are you going to validate that you're not introducing new hallucinations or new security, vulnerabilities or opportunities for mistakes? Right? Those are things that, while we get fascinated by the big announcements, the bravado of the big announcements, the numbers of the big announcements, I think the downstream for enterprises and for anybody consuming this technology, or making it part of something that they want to offer to their markets, to their customers, their partners, is very, very different, right? These headlines don't necessarily mean exciting news. In fact, it might very well mean, like, really, really difficult ways of having to operate and having to try and be successful. So, in the bigger picture, I look at these announcements and I think, you want to kind of put them in some context. Are they big? Are they really big? Are they just a Me Too type of thing? But then I think it's really important to think about it from multiple perspectives. Think about it from a technology perspective. Think about it from an economics perspective. Think about it from not just the people building it, but the people who have to consume that technology downstream of you, people that are going to be putting that into something that they then have to live with, right? So I think there's a lot to be thought about with these. I just happened to pull these two because they happen to have come up with this week. But I think, given that we are in a time right now of a lot of change, it's important to have a framework in your mind to how to think about it, but also know that it's important to think about it from multiple viewpoints, right? And they may not all be viewpoints that you want to look at it from, because they might be disruptive to your world. They might be difficult in your world, but you have to understand, how do I go about looking at these? And then understanding, once you've really understood the facts, you've understood the technology, you've understood the implications to your ecosystem, you've understood the implications to the economics around it for you, then you can begin to start to understand or begin to think about, okay, what next steps would I take from this announcement? And then also, how quickly do we expect the next announcement to come along? And will that disrupt this sort of mental model that you've built for what you have to do? So anyways, trying to provide a little bit of light, on some of the thinking that I talked about on Whitney and Cote's podcast, but also just for anybody who's looking at all these announcements and feeling a little bit overwhelmed and trying to figure them out. I think the best thing you can do is start to build yourself some mental models. Think about, how you go about analyzing them, where you get your information from. And then once you've sort of put it in a new light, have an understanding of it, you can feel like there's some clarity of it. Then you can start to make some decisions on what you should do, if you should care, what sort of actions you might take or not take, and whether you need to make sort of a long-term versus short-term sort of a decision based on that announcement. So anyways, with that, I'm going to wrap up. Hope everybody's doing well. Thank you all for listening. We are closing in on the end of the month. February is coming up on us. February is a little short month. February is also when we start to usually see the tech industry kind of wake up out of its slumber of January. It's figured out its reorganizations. It's figured out its budgets for the year. It's figured out its quotas for the year. People are, kind of ready to get into, what the year is going to look like for your business. And so I expect that we'll start to see February pick up quite a bit. So anyways, with that, thanks y'all for listening. Thanks for telling a friend. show@thecloudcast.net. If you want to send us questions, send us ideas for shows or topics, as well as all the ways on social media, you can hit us up. You can find those in the links in the show notes. So with that, I'll wrap it up. Thank you all for listening. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.